Dear guests, dear members of wider scientific community, dear students, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and let me give you all our warmest welcome. We wish to welcome you here at Lantieri's Castle to another in the series of scientific evenings organized by the University of Nova Gorica. It is my distinct pleasure and great honor to give some introductory notes on today's speaker, Professor Dr. Jukka Jokilehto. Jukka Jokilehto graduated in architecture and urban planning from the Polytechnic University of Helsinki and studied at ICROM and the Institute of Advanced Architectural Studies, obtaining his doctorate from the University of York. He has taught conservation history and theory, and the planning and management of the built heritage on the international courses of ICROM, as well as at numerous international universities, including University of York, Polytechnic University of Turin, University of Rome. And of course, from 2005, he is teaching history and theory of conservation at our doctoral study in economics and techniques of architectural and environmental conservation. Since 1972, Professor Jokilehto has been director of courses in architectural and urban conservation at the International Center for the Preservation and Restoration of the Cultural Property, which is created by UNESCO. He also served as the chief of the sector of architectural conservation and assistant to the Director General, and as such has undertaken numerous missions and projects almost in all continents. He has been member of the advisory missions on behalf of UNESCO, ICROM, and ICOMOS. But quoting the words of Mr. Munir Bushnaki, which is certainly one of the most eminent figures in leading international organizations, the contribution of Jukka Jokilehto to the understanding and development of conservation theory and practice cannot be summed up by his official job titles. Rather, his legacy can be found in the thousands of people, students and professionals from all corners of the globe that he has trained over the past 40 years. But perhaps most importantly, his authority rests in the contribution he has made to the understanding and development of conservation philosophy. His groundbreaking book, A History of Architectural Conservation, remains a fundamental text for any scholar in the field. His works on authenticity, significance, outstanding universal value, and urban and landscape conservation have contributed enormously by any standard and has earned him an indisputable position as a leader and innovator in the conservation field. Last but not the least, I wish to stress that it is our great honor to work with him, to have him as a permanent lecturer and benefit from your knowledge, experience, and generosity. So let me give you our warmest welcome.
Thank you very much. I should like to start like the Pope Francesco. Buonasera. It sounds very impressive what Sasha was saying. It is much more pragmatic in reality. Anyway, I have the pleasure to come back here, and I'm very pleased to have been invited. Thank you very much for the university to give a view to the conservation of cultural heritage in the recent years. I was asked to invent a title, so I thought that I will talk about what has been happening in the World Heritage context and what has been especially happening in the last several years. Starting with this slide, the international doctrinal framework is the basis for conservation work today. We have UNESCO, ICROM, but also the Council of Europe, who have contributed to the establishment of a framework of principles. I also added here a slide from a picture actually from Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, where two of the large Buddhas were destroyed. This is one of the Buddhas before and after destruction. And it is interesting now that there has been a lot of international effort to try to think, what shall we do with this heritage? One of the proposals is to reconstruct these Buddhas. But this has met with a lot of opposition. And in fact, UNESCO has said that it should not be done. You cannot start reconstructing in reinforced concrete and bricks a statue which is carved out of the rock. But we can do something. I don't have the picture of this Bamiyan Valley, but it's a very large valley which has a lot of history. And in fact, this whole site was put as a cultural landscape. It was put on the World Heritage List after the destruction of the Buddhas. So there is a lot of significance in this place, even if the Buddhas have been destroyed. Now, if we go to the development of conservation philosophy in the second half of the 20th century, I see that there are like three major moments or three major parts of this development. One is the period which follows the Second World War destruction. That is the 1950s and 60s, when we have, for example, the Venice Charter, which is giving some principles. The Venice Charter says that we are becoming conscious of these various monuments and sites as a common heritage for humanity. That is exactly our challenge, because in due time it has been recognized that this heritage is particularly recognized for its diversity. So our common heritage is our heritage because it represents the different cultures, different ways of thinking, different periods of time. And then the question that we can have today, and that is my personal challenge, is what are the universal principles that are applicable in all these cases? So how can we put together common heritage with universal principles if the common heritage is representing a diversity of all the cultures? In any case, in 1970s, we have another important period, and this World Heritage Convention is adopted by UNESCO in 1972. And the World Heritage Convention starts building up a sort of framework for the common basis for conservation philosophy. And of course, the conservation philosophy cannot be too much in detail. It must be more like a methodology. We must actually work in order to understand what are the questions that we have to put to this heritage in order to find the answers from the heritage itself. We are not going to the heritage with a template response, a recipe, but we are going there with an open mind. From the 1970s, we have broadened our understanding of what is cultural heritage from monuments and archaeological sites to include historic urban areas, cultural landscapes, cultural roots. In the 1990s, it's a very important period because in the 1990s, the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO decided that it was necessary to look at the whole environment. It was not enough to look at monuments and sites. We also needed to have a broader context, and therefore the cultural landscape concept was coined in 1992. In 1994, there was a meeting in Japan, the so-called in Nara, which actually prepared the Nara document on authenticity. The Nara document on authenticity actually discusses the diversity of cultural heritage and also the aspect of intangible cultural heritage as important issues. And in fact, culture is intangible. What is culture? I have been reading now recently a prehistorian archaeologist whose name is Colin Renfrew. And Renfrew is saying that human beings developed first in Africa, sometime 150,000 years, maybe much earlier also, but from 150,000 years ago, it started becoming more or less the same type of human being as we are today. And from 60,000 years ago, the human beings started going to different parts of the world. They went out of Africa. And until 60,000 years ago, human beings developed their physical characteristics. In the past 60,000 years, they have developed their cultural characteristics. So our culture, human culture, is about 60 years old, we can say. And because the people went from Africa in different directions, they developed their own cultures, and that is the reason why we have this diversity. The Venice Charter actually, in fact, emphasizes this question of commonality of heritage. But it also says that the different regions and different countries, different people, need to think of their own charters where they implement the universal principles into their local context. The World Heritage Convention is also drawing attention to the fact that that the heritage that is we are gradually recognizing is threatened by different types of problems. One is the development itself. Although, if we think about it, cultural heritage and recognition of cultural heritage, or recognition of something as cultural heritage, is part of the development. It is the developed people who recognize it. It has also been said that some parts of this cultural heritage are of so much outstanding value to all the peoples in the world. And therefore they need to be given a special attention in terms of conservation. That is the aim of the World Heritage Convention. In fact, the early World Heritage inscriptions were dominated by monuments and archaeological sites. Maybe it is interesting for you to look at this. There is Split, Diocletian's Palace, which is one of the first World Heritage nominations. And then you have Isfahan, Egypt, Urnes from Norway, just to give an idea of what type of monuments and sites were put into the list. But then gradually, these ideas have broadened. And for example, historic towns came into the into the game. But already in 1979 we have Kotor, which was put not just as a town, but they said it was natural and cultural historical region of Kotor. And in fact, it is part of the, what is it called? The base of the Boka Kotorska, which we actually put. They are 4 bays, but they only put 2. And the other 2 are then now subject to tourist development and so on. Anyway, it's interesting that Kotor in some way is already very much in the foreground, and anticipating later developments. The world, if we look at the definition of what is historic town for World Heritage at the beginning, it was first recognized as a group of buildings. So it means that a town was fundamentally architecture, different types of architecture. But slowly it has been broadened. So we are now also understanding that town is not just architecture, it's also the people and the functions and the social and other cultural activities which take place. It's interesting then that in 1992, when the World Heritage Convention was celebrating its 20th anniversary, there was a little booklet which was circulated, which is called The World Heritage Convention 20 Years Later. It was written by Professor Leon Presuir, who used to be the person on behalf of ICOMOS to evaluate World Heritage nominations. And he said that now as Japan has decided to ratify the World Heritage Convention, they should also check that their conservation philosophy is correct. That was the reason why the Japanese government proposed that we should have a little meeting about discussing what is conservation philosophy, what is authenticity, what is the truthfulness and credibility of our sources of information. And so there was a meeting in Nara in 1994, which fundamentally emphasized the diversity of cultures and heritage as the irreplaceable source of spiritual and intellectual richness for all humankind. So it is now the diversity that we want to maintain. And one of the problems we have today, if we look at our towns, is that very often a very small part of a town is from before Second World War. Whatever has happened after the Second World War usually is exactly the same, whether you are in China or in Africa or in Slovenia, I think, more or less. So our task is to try to give attention and respect to what represents our particular cultural identity. It's interesting, if we are looking at the recent trends from pre-Nara to post-Nara, we can say that there was, first of all, originally priority was put on the exceptional, but now we have more holistic approach. Previously we had focus on individual monuments and sites. Now we are looking at the context and larger areas. Before we had focus on material and aesthetics. Now we are more process-oriented, including functional activities and so on. Before it was the responsibility of authorities to take care of conservation, but now increasingly the community is being involved. Before, conservation was a static event. You kept this building as it was. But now we are understanding that conservation is also can be a dynamic process, which can include a certain amount of change without losing the significance of the site. Also, the definition of towns is changing. For example, in the case of the city of Bath in UK, it is the whole town which is put on the World Heritage List already in 1987. But it was justified because of its architecture. But then it's interesting that when we go to Provins, a town in France, which developed as in function to the medieval commercial fairs from the 10th, 11th century. It was an international event several times a year. There were no monuments, no important buildings in this town. And it was interesting, I was responsible for evaluating it, and I was in favor of proposing this to the World Heritage List. But there were architect en chef of the French government who came to say that, please don't put it because there are no monuments. So it's interesting that here we were looking at a town almost like a cultural site, not anymore just as a group of buildings. And it is in this period, more or less, about 2000, 2001, that we are beginning to have a change in attitude. So we are not anymore looking at just material, and so we are also thinking about something else. Of course, we can define our landscape, our territory, in different ways. The European Landscape Convention is saying that landscape means an area as perceived by people. So the landscape, in some way, is a perception. Landscape is in my mind. Landscape is not in the territory. It's here. But of course, and then of course, we have to identify what are the proper management or planning tools that we need to use in order to take care of my perception. And of course, it means we have to also raise awareness. It's a learning process to understand what is a landscape and what is not a landscape. Another aspect which has come out is something which is called heritage route, which is composed of often like a pilgrimage route, like this is a Ruta de Compostela in Spain, where the pilgrimage, where pilgrims traveled in order to go to San Giacomo di Compostela from the Middle Ages or even later. And of course we have in Italy also, we have the Via Francigena, which is the linking Rome to Paris and London and so on, which is a pilgrimage route as well. So cultural routes have become one aspect which has become quite interesting also in the World Heritage List. And then we have this cultural landscape concept, which came out in 1992 in the World Heritage Issues. And it's interesting that now today there is an increasing number of landscapes, cultural landscapes, which are put on the World Heritage List. But I would like to stress that if we are talking about landscape or cultural landscape, we are talking about two different things. Because landscape is a perception, is a visual image. But cultural landscape is a scientifically, archaeologically developed understanding of your territory. So management and conservation are completely different things. But also the whole process of knowledge and understanding goes in a different way. The first cultural landscape that was inscribed on the World Heritage List was the Tongariro National Park in New Zealand. And it was interesting to listen to the discussion because at that time, usually a cultural heritage site had to have something physical, something constructed. And there was nothing constructed by human beings on this because it was a sacred mountain. It was just an association. So we recognized for the first time in 1993 that an association of meaning to a place makes it a cultural landscape. In fact, we have basically three types of cultural landscapes in the World Heritage context. One is the designed cultural landscape, like a garden, English landscape garden. The other one is the organically grown cultural landscape, which is the result of agricultural activities or industrial activities or something, whatever. And the third one is associated cultural landscape, which is like this thing. But of course, with the cultural landscape concept, we are again entering a new ideas, new way of thinking. For example, the vineyards in France, in Saint-Émilion, which is called the jurisdiction of Saint-Émilion. It is a very large area where the Saint-Émilion city is in the center, and the vineyards are surrounding it. But it's interesting that if you look at the nomination document, most of the nomination document talks about the architecture of the city, and very little is mentioned actually about the vineyards. So, but the French attitude is still very much linked with the monuments at that time. Maybe it is now changing. But for example, in England, in 2000, the Blenavon industrial landscape has no monumental heritage. It is simply an industrial site. And I think this is, in a way, the direction where gradually we are going with heritage, which also means that the question of what is protection and management becomes a key issue in the conservation. So conservation becomes a process. Conservation is a process, it's the critical process where you are sort of like monitoring and observing and taking the necessary steps to correct the development so that we are not losing those qualities which have been recognized for their heritage value. And of course, there are new concepts which are gradually coming up. I already mentioned the concept of authenticity, which was discussed in the case of Nara, in the Nara conference. It was brought up by the Japanese because there was a discussion about whether the Japanese actually are, what is true in Japanese cultural heritage. And it is recognized that, for example, if we have a Shinto shrine, like Ise shrine, it is the process of reconstruction which itself is the cult. It is the intangible aspect of maintaining this place in order. It is not the physical material, but it is the process. And in fact, then we are coming to the concept of integrity, which has been also, again, has been put on the, in reference to the social functional context. What are the functions which together define all the elements that make it significant, this place? And then we can look at the historical structural integrity, which means what is the condition of this place? What is the historical stratigraphy of this place? And then the relationship with its context or its setting, which becomes another important issue. And of course, this is Vienna in 1683 and 2013. We noticed that there has been change. And of course, that is normal that things change. Life means change. The question is that we could guide this change in a way that we are maintaining those qualities which are gradually being built up to the site over the centuries. This is another pair of pictures from London in the 18th century and today. That is a little bit like an imagined picture of today. I think computer picture. But what it means is that we are actually changing, for example, London quite drastically. Now the question is, what is the heritage of London? Those are challenges that we can put. With these ideas in mind, when Vienna was put on the World Heritage List in 2001, there was a problem because, although I did not, this doesn't really show this picture, but for example, there were skyscrapers coming up around Vienna. And so in 2005, the Vienna governor decided to invite an international conference to discuss what shall we do with introduction of modern architecture into existing historic environment. And as a result, the conference decided to coin the concept of historic urban landscape, HUL. Historic urban landscape was set by the World Heritage Committee that is not necessarily just a piece of land, but it is our management approach to the territory that exists. It is not just a visible territory, but it is generally the territory which is influenced by the city, by the historic area, and that influences the historic area. So there is like a two-way development, things that influence the heritage and heritage influences the rest. So there is the relationship with the context becomes important. The aspects of whole are very closely related to the concept of integrity. And in fact, the integrity is one of the issues which is now being discussed in the World Heritage context. And I think it still needs to have a longer discussion. Authenticity, I mean, if we look at what is the difference between integrity and authenticity, integrity defines the elements that together define, that together become the references for the significance. Authenticity is a qualitative term where you verify that these are true and credible as sources of information. So integrity identifies the sources of information, and authenticity verifies their truthfulness. The concept of historic urban landscape is increasingly becoming important, and I think it is probably one of the most important recent developments in the World Heritage context, which will probably should have some impact on planning policies, territorial planning policies, generally speaking. We have actually already several research projects, doctoral or master theses, which are being done in different universities. And of course, then you have the question of what does visual integrity, for example, mean in terms of a territory. There was recently, last year actually, in India, a World Heritage expert meeting where they discussed what should we mean with visual integrity. And in that meeting, it was decided that the visual integrity should refer to the area which is defined as World Heritage. And then the outside, the context or the setting of this World Heritage area should be monitored for any negative impacts. So we are talking about the visual impact from outside to this site. I'm not quite convinced that I totally agree with this, but maybe it is one way of looking at the situation. Of course, the whole concept of cultural landscape is gradually developing, and with it we are introducing the understanding of cultural landscape, not only referred to major monuments, but also these vernacular, ordinary wooden buildings. So we are gradually beginning to understand that the human being is not just living in royal palaces and cathedrals, but also in ordinary houses. And for example, if we look at the Cornwall area, Cornwall is the southwest England. It is a very large area where you have a serial nomination of areas which were defined as World Heritage. But the whole area was not defined as a buffer zone. So at the time of this inscription to the World Heritage list, and I was asked to present it to the World Heritage Committee. So the question was raised, what about the buffer zone? Because the buffer zone was supposed to be the control mechanism for what is outside the World Heritage area, which can have a visual impact, negative impact, and so on. And, but then in the discussion, the committee accepted the idea that the planning control in this whole area was so strong that it actually corresponded to the concept of buffer zone, so there's no specific buffer zone was anymore necessary. When we look at a place like Harar Jugol in Ethiopia, we can say that this is it's a traditional town. Sorry, it's very difficult to see in the picture, but it's a very traditional town with ordinary traditional rural people. But the town is actually very, very much part of the cultural landscape. I think that the World Heritage nomination was too strict. We have taken too small an area. It should have been much bigger if we want to keep it. So the question is then to develop an attitude, a cultural attitude towards this area in order to make sure that we are actually able to maintain what is the value, what is the quality of this place. But it is then, especially in this recognition of diversity and the intangible cultural heritage, we actually are fighting our current challenges. This picture is from a place called Zabit in Yemen, which is on the World Heritage list, where you have these fantastic ladies, but they are all covered up black, face and everything. So they said the post box because you have a little window here for the eyes. This question of cultural landscape was, this discussion of Declaration of Cultural Diversity was recognized by UNESCO in 2001. And in 2003, UNESCO had the Convention for Intangible Cultural Heritage, which was in some way a result of the Nara conference of 1994. It is interesting that in 2004 we had another Nara meeting to discuss what is authenticity, how to integrate the World Heritage Convention and the 2003 Convention, and it didn't work because the people who were defending the intangible cultural heritage didn't agree with the ideas of the World Heritage Convention. So there is still a long way to go in that direction, but I think we must do that. But the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention has actually started developing strategies for safeguarding the intangible heritage, which means culture. And so it is necessary to establish some sort of strategy which is then developed specifically for different types of heritage. And they have guidelines and guidebooks which have been now developed, which includes how to go about establishing a project and following it up in order to establish the policies, institutional infrastructures, inventories, involvement stakeholders, enhancement of practical knowledge, and so on. And at the same time, it has also been interesting to see that UNESCO is now putting increasing effort to the recognition of the diversity of cultural expressions. Before we talked about works of art, now we talk about diversity of cultural expressions. So we have broadened this concept, and the question is not just to maintain and keep something which is from the past, but also encourage diversity of cultural expressions for the future. So putting emphasis also for the development. And it's also associated with economic aspects. In fact, the cultural diversity is also a question of investments. So they said there is an urgent need to invest in cultural diversity and dialogue between the different cultures. and the concept of economy and culture are becoming one of the focal points for this type of activity. We can say, as I am a non-economist, I would say that economy refers to the system within which a community arranges its resource management over time. But we can also say that culture is the generator and the product of development within the evolving framework of the economy of community. So culture and economy should be together. They together form the system of how the community works. They are not enemies one to the other. We are not supposed to work against each other, but together. It's interesting then to read the Council of Europe Framework Convention on the value of cultural heritage for society. Here we are opening up, so the definition of cultural heritage is no more defined to anything specific, like physical heritage or immaterial heritage. It is a group of resources which are inherited from the past and which are associated with some qualities and values. And particularly, this same convention is inventing or proposing, emphasizing the concept of heritage community, which consists of the people who value specific aspects of cultural heritage which they wish to sustain and transmit to future generations. Everyone, alone and collective, has the right to benefit, but everyone also has the right to respect and to contribute to the conservation of these issues. It's interesting that these are also issues which come up in very recent meetings, like the Kyoto 40th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention in 2012, when the Kyoto Vision was written, and it says that we have lots of challenges. We have development pressures, we have conflicts, we have man-made and natural disasters, and so on. We still need to recognize lots of heritage, possible heritage. We know that there is an enormous challenge our planet is facing in terms of climate change and all sorts of physical problems which are faced by the scientists today. But we also have the importance of the role of community. So it's interesting that this 40th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention put two issues on the table. One is the climate change and the natural environment, and the other one is involvement of local community, heritage community. Of course, this is partly related to tourism, cultural tourism, but I think that tourism is not the only reason why we are keeping heritage. Tourism is one of the outcomes, one of the benefits of heritage issues. Heritage is oriented towards the people, towards the community, those who are responsible and who take care and who live with it. And of course, we have the UNESCO umbrella of international actions. We have the World Heritage issues, we have the intangible heritage, etc., etc., etc. This is the framework within which we have to work, which is the framework which provides us the tools and instruments to cope with the challenges that keeping the diversity of heritage resources in the world is made possible. And of course, we also have a theory of conservation. The theory of conservation is the underlying approach of recognition of something as heritage, and once recognized, it would help to understand what it is to be conserved in each case. Of course, one way is to conserve putting a roof over the thing. But when we have places like this sacred grove in Africa, then conservation is very much dependent on the participation of the community. Conservation, and it says in the NARA document, conservation of cultural heritage in all its forms and historical periods is rooted in the values attributed to the heritage. So we have to, but the values are the product of recognition. They are the product of learning processes. If we learn to appreciate things, we then can associate a value to these places, and then we have to find the way to maintain those issues, those qualities that we are interested in keeping. The Nara document has become like a, shall we say, a watershed in some way in our thinking about what is cultural heritage, because it has opened up to possibilities which were not thought about before Nara. So we are talking about heritage as something which can be dynamically evolving and developing and evolving. We are not taking about something, conservation is necessarily something that you stick to this and you never allow any change. Another aspect which is, of course, coming up here is the concept of capacity building, because we have to involve different types of stakeholders. So it's a question of establishing a learning process, making people responsible, understanding things. It's only through understanding and recognition that we actually can be sure that we may do the right thing. The guidelines or the manuals that we are providing are not necessarily there to give you the answers, but they are there to give you the questions, the things to ask. So I started by asking, what is the universality of conservation versus diversity of heritage? And it's interesting, you have this theory of Cesare Brandi, which has been translated into something like 20 languages. Here we have it in, I don't know, Chinese and Greek and German and so on, in Korean, in Russian, in Arabic. It has been translated into all languages, so it is relevant to all languages. And I think that when we are thinking about philosophy, we are still reading the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. We are still thinking about Immanuel Kant. So the philosophy, if we are looking for truth, understanding of something, it doesn't age. It remains always, it always keeps its actuality. So the question is, what we are interested in conservation is in identification of significance. The recognition of cultural, historical significance and specificity of heritage resources necessitates systematic surveys and interpretation of all meaningful elements and features, tangible and intangible, as a basis for safeguarding and conservation, which must often cope with dynamically evolving situations. Together, these elements form the basis for the integrity of heritage property. And we can keep that authenticity refers to the verification of the truthfulness and credibility of these sources of information. Values and identity are the result of learning processes. I think that one of the issues that I have noticed very often is that we are confusing the different concepts. I would like to keep distinct what is meant by significance, what is a value, what is identity, what is integrity, what is authenticity. Because otherwise, we may not communicate properly our thinking. And I'm closing here with a picture from my country, which is Finland, although I don't always go there very often anymore. Thank you very much.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for this rich but still clear and inspiring lecture. I'm very sure that there must be some questions.
Maybe. You are stunned.
Microphone.
I have actually two questions. I have more than two, but I will try to summarize everything in two questions. The first one is about the first part of your lecture, when you have been showing us the way the approach to heritage preservation has been developing along the 20th century, especially, and we noticed these three main steps, the Venice that you called Venice Charter, and then World Heritage Convention and the Nara Declaration. And it seems, but it's not the case, of course, that this development of the heritage preservation process came through decisions of international organizations, in a sense. It came from discussions at an international level. But this is not the case, and this is the question I want to put you. Of course, behind all these decisions, there were plenty of discussions at lower level, in a sense, in the academics, for example, in the research. My question is, since you have been working in these big organizations, especially ICROM, that was especially established for the teaching of conservation at the international level, how these movements at the lower level, let's say in the small universities, big universities, the research centers and so on, came to the heads, to the institutional heads, let's say. How these institutions are grasping the ideas coming from the practice, let's say, and the research. So this is the first question. And should I do the second one?
No, maybe it's better that Professor replies on the first one. It was very long. In my book about the history of architectural conservation, I showed the process for awareness raising and development, educational development, which starts from the individual people. The individual people get rather bigger groups slowly, and it's then gradually that the states take it over, and it's only very recently that the international community has actually becoming aware. Very often, for example, if we look at the urban conservation, it started from individual cities where you had some people who were concerned about things, and then there were international gatherings which brought it to the attention of a larger audience, and then from here we are taking it to international recommendations. So the international recommendations, conventions and so on, they are always based on a consultation process. So they are based on the consultation with recognized experts in the different countries, different learning institutions. Also, if we look at the evaluation process of World Heritage Sites by ICOMOS, it happens so that ICOMOS has a sort of like a desk evaluator, but they also contact these learning centers, the different universities or professors who are informed about these issues, and then we collect this information. There is also a site visit to talk with the local people. It is these processes which slowly, gradually gather a body of information which is then recognized sufficiently important to be taken into the international charters or recommendations. But once it has happened, then the reverse can also be the case. And today, what I'm thinking is that very often some of the issues which are related to conservation strategies and philosophies, conservation, definition of concepts, it takes place especially at the international level. And sometimes the local level is not properly involved, or has not been properly involved.
But now when we're looking also at the World Heritage Committee meetings, until 1990s, we had usually not more than 100 people in a meeting. But now there are nearly 2,000. So there are lots of observers who come in order to, it's a learning process. So it's a two-way system. You build up first a basis, but then once the basis has been recognized, then it starts feeding back. So it's like that is how I see it.
Second question. We had another one. No?
A shorter one.
The second question is about the categories, heritage community. The heritage community and has been issuing, let's say, in a sense, categories in the heritage, like settlements or monuments and historic towns and so on. But then at the end, let's say, in a way, landscape came out, as well as this intangible asset of landscape, and this seems to push out, in a sense, all these previous categories. Is this true in your point of view, and what will happen in this case if landscape can gather all these previous categories?
Well, you want to have a short answer? No. If you have a long answer. I think that the international doctrine, if I'm calling it international doctrine, which started several decades ago, let's say from the Venice Charter onwards, is a gradual building up process. And if it is not that, then it is not international doctrine. It is integrating new aspects into the process. It has to reinterpret. It's a living process. So I'm sure that if we are talking about a piece of sculpture, or we are talking about the cultural landscape, of course there is a completely different approach to how to keep this piece of wood or the cultural landscape. But the concept may be the same. You have the same process. We have to identify what are we talking about, what is the character, what are the specific qualities of this particular issue, whether it is an object or whether it is an area. So what I'm thinking is that the conservation theory and the principles should, at the very general level, be the same, but then of course they are increasingly specified when you come closer to the actual management of a landscape, for example. But of course, it's a process.
There is another thank you for your question. Another question?
Another question. As you have said before, it is important to underline that the conservation is a critical process. Is a critical process of management in which we should recognize the qualities and the significance of the place that should be conserved, and in which we should recognize the potentialities of the city that should be valorized. In this way, how can we link the necessities of conservation with the necessities of development? This is the spirit and the aim of the last recommendation, Historic Urban Landscape, that claims that the HUL approach aims at preserving the qualities of the urban and the human environment. How can we link the necessities of conservation with the necessities of development in a place? And how the cultural heritage, the tangible and intangible heritage, can be a factor for development?
Well, basically, very short answer is through capacity building. I mean, we have to, I'm thinking about a government. For example, now Italy, Matteo Renzi, I'm very interested in what he's able to do. But he can only do something if he is able to get enough support for his ideas. And I think that in the society, we have conservation people, and we have developers, we have tourism operators, we have different types of sectors. They are all interested in the same thing, but maybe they have different approaches. So the question is to take these people together, to have identify these stakeholders, bring them together, discuss it, and to see where we have a shared understanding, what we all want to preserve as something important. I mean, I am from Finland. In Finland, in the 1950s and 60s, we were reconstructing the country after the Second World War, because our little neighbor, eastern neighbor, had not been very nice with us. And then we were always looking at the bigger people in the West, like America. And we were very much impressed by the American development, and we wanted to become Americans ourselves. And we destroyed all our heritage in the 1960s and 70s. It's only when we had destroyed our heritage that people became aware that we had some heritage before. Now the people are saying, okay, yes, we have actually heritage. Before they had destroyed their heritage, they were a bit saying, okay, our heritage, now it's not important. We don't have colosseums and Taj Mahals, but just wooden huts. Now we realized actually it was important. So the question is somehow to talk, to discuss, to communicate. Conservation is fundamentally communication. If you don't communicate, no conservation.
Very clear. We are already a little bit late, but I would have one question.
You have a question?
Yes, very easy one. How should, in your opinion, education evolve in terms of contents and modes in order to respond properly in appropriate way to all these challenges? After 40 years of teaching, do you have any suggestions?
Well, I think we have to start early. I think we have to start from the elementary schools. And we have to teach the people to learn to look at the environment. There was even Alvar Aalto, who is a sort of fairly well-known gentleman, used to be. Alvar Aalto was saying that everybody should be taught architecture. We are not necessarily all becoming architects, but we should learn to appreciate architecture. And I think somehow in the past, it was the case. For example, when I went to school, I was taught woodworking crafts because we had to learn to build objects in wood. So we also learned to maintain our wooden buildings. Now the problem today is that our buildings are prefabricated in a factory, and their maintenance is much more complicated. But if we can develop our building technology so that we can again be able to maintain ourselves, maybe this is a type of skill which could be integrated into the technological developments, but also in the teaching institutions, so that we are making the technology and the learning processes meet somewhere. Because now it seems that technological approaches are going their own way and the schools are running behind. So we should somehow make both ends meet. Then, of course, if you are asking personally, then that's another problem. We can talk about it over the wine.
Okay. If there are not any other questions, we can continue a discussion also downstairs. We have a small refreshment. Guests, thank you very much for your attention and participation. And Professor Jukka Jokilehto, thank you very, very much for your lecture.
Thank you very much.
Good evening.